Hello and welcome everybody. Good evening to those in Singapore. Good morning to those of you calling from other parts of the world as well. And a very, very warm welcome to today's webinar, which is entitled Board Crisis Preparedness. Is your board ready? My name is David Kelly and I'm the Executive Director here at the British Chamber of Commerce in Singapore. The Chamber is delighted to host this session, which is brought to you in collaboration with the Financial Times. The Financial Times run a number of workshops, networking events, and formal courses in Hong Kong and Singapore designed for aspiring and existing non-executive directors who are looking to develop their career and expand their professional network. The programme brings high-profile experienced and dynamic tutors who are experts in their field together to share their unique real-life experience and case studies. So with a great backing and great support from Financial Times, this is looking to be a really, really great session today for you. The past year has highlighted the need for boards to be agile in their response to crises in order to support and guide management in a time of upheaval and business transformation, which I think a lot of us have seen over the last 18 months, certainly. Many boards have adapted really well, while others may still be adjusting to the changed business environment that we're operating in. So today our panel will discuss how your board can continue to strengthen its effectiveness in this area and be better prepared for future crises. You should all be muted as guests of this webinar. So to communicate with our incredible panel today, please do post your questions to our speakers in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and these will be addressed throughout the session. There are also a couple of polls today, so this is all about interaction. Please do make sure you get involved. It's going to be set up to be a really, really great discussion. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Chris Moon, Asia Director of the Financial Times, to introduce our panel, to set the scene and to kick the programme off. So Chris, a very, very warm welcome to you. Thank you so much for all of your support. I'm really looking forward to this session.
Thank you very much for the introduction, David. Much appreciated. Thanks also obviously to the British Chamber of Commerce Singapore. As David said, my name is Chris Moon. I'm the Asia Director for the Financial Times Board Director Programme. The Board Director Programme, it started in the UK back in 2011. We brought it over to Hong Kong in 2013. We run workshops all throughout the region. So we also run workshops in Singapore as well as Hong Kong. And we have now around about 3,000 global alumni. So why are we all here today then? Now, a crisis by its nature can happen at any time, and it can obviously escalate immediately. Now, the impact on operational capabilities, the reputational damage, and of course the bottom line, they can be immense. It is therefore the role of the board to implement procedures in order to handle crisis and obviously mitigate fallout. Now, most organizations will have a key focus on risk, but research does show that there are many that may not necessarily have plans to handle an immediate crisis. We are therefore here today to hear from the experts about what a board can do to prepare for such an event. I do want to stress, though, that in the session today, we are going to be discussing COVID and in some instances, beneficial effects of the crisis. Now, I don't believe that we can do that without first acknowledging that any positive effects have come at a truly devastating price. We're not insensitive to the tragedy, but we must learn from it. So I am very pleased today to welcome our panelists, including Professor Ray Baker, Eliza Knox, and Vivian Lines. So Ray began his career at PricewaterhouseCoopers. He's a licensed CPA and holds a PhD in accounting. Ray has a keen interest in corporate governance as both an academic and a practitioner, having advised many organizations and boards, in addition to holding adjunct professorships at Tongji University and Hong Kong University, where he teaches crisis management. Ray is a member of the Financial Times Non-Executive Director Diploma faculty. Eliza has significant experience in financial services, international and tech experience. Her most recent roles were head of Asia at Twitter and Cloudflare. She is now engaged in a portfolio life and is currently a non-executive director at Tyro Payments Australia, Health Metrics Australia, and Healthway Medical Group Singapore, as well as having previously served on several other listed boards as well as governmental committees. She is a contributing columnist at Forbes, writing about rising and thriving in the corporate world, and will be publishing a book on this topic next year. Vivian is an award-winning senior advisor to listed and private companies globally and government organizations in APAC, with extensive experience in stakeholder and corporate communications, plus crisis planning and management and reputation protection. Vivian was formerly Global Vice Chairman and Chairman for Asia Pacific at Hill & Knowlton Strategies, and was also head of Hill & Knowlton's Global Business Ethics Committee for more than a decade. Vivian holds the Financial Times Non-Executive Director Diploma and also sits on the Board Director Program Advisory Board. So welcome to all our panelists. And what I'd like to do really is, first of all, to set the scene and to really get our panelists' thoughts on what is meant by the word crisis. So how is this interpreted? Ray, I'd like to start with you, please.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for being here today. And thanks for BritCham for hosting us. I'll start out with two formal academic definitions of what a crisis is. And we'll start with Rosenthal, Charles, and Hart. They state that a crisis represents a serious threat to the basic structures of a system, which under time pressure and highly uncertain circumstances necessitates vital decisions. So the key takeaways from that definition are time pressure, uncertainty, and vital decisions. Another definition comes from Cohen, McMullen, and Cohen and McMullen state there are three elements of a crisis: a triggering event causing significant change, the inability to cope with the change that has taken place, and a trigger so significant as to pose a threat to the survival of the organization. And for me, that phrase, the survival of the organization, is the key differentiator between crisis and all other events. A crisis event, if not addressed, would have the potential to drive an organization into bankruptcy. But I'm sure our other panelists have their own thoughts on what crisis is, so maybe I can pass it to Eliza.
Hi, I'm Eliza, and sorry,
Eliza, sorry.
Everybody's always issues with my name. Great to be here. I guess, the things that I understand about this, I'm not a professor, but are these kind of three levels that align with what you said, Ray. One is an incident, and most things that boards need to respond to are probably pretty close to incidents, but they're still a pretty big deal. When we get to it later in the panel, I'll talk about something that happened on one of my boards this January that I suppose people could call a crisis, but I don't think it is. But an incident would be something unplanned, impact, but not enough to bring down the company, which is what you were kind of saying, Ray, and can probably be managed mostly internally, although often even an incident needs the help of external parties with someone like Vivian who helps us tell the story to the public. Then the second would be an emergency, which is still unplanned, but probably more serious, maybe higher impact, and almost definitely needs external resources, both to mitigate the problem and to tell the story. And then a crisis, which is why it's interesting, because the way I learned about this, I'm not sure, like COVID's a crisis, but it doesn't fit this description of being completely out of control. I'm very sorry. For those of you who are not in Singapore, you might know that National Day was officially, well, it wasn't postponed, but all the festivities were postponed from August 9th to the 21st. So we still have the National Day Parade coming up, and they are currently practicing over my house. So you can hear the airplanes, a little bit of levity. So I guess that's one thing that shows you the board of a government decided in something between an incident, an emergency, and a crisis to actually move our most important annual event. So we can talk about what that means. So our National Day Parade, which is always on August 9th, we didn't have it last year, and this year it's August 21st. So I've always learned about crisis as being out of control and really broad impact. and, would take me closer to something like Enron, where there was nothing that could be done to save the company. Whereas COVID, which I know we'll talk about today, would be something between an incident and an emergency, because most companies have been able to manage it. Even airlines have gone and parked their planes in deserts. They've managed it in a way where it hasn't completely brought the company down. So that's my thinking about it.
Okay, let me add on. I'm missing having the planes fly over my house because I'm currently in Hong Kong rather than in Singapore. But as soon as I'm back there, I'll catch them. I think COVID has probably made the word crisis fashionable. Many of the companies I've worked with in the past have really resisted using the word crisis, as they see it as an alarmist activity. Instead, they tended to call everything an issue. And I guess this is very much what Eliza was saying in terms of an incident. They'd call it an issue, such as, we've got an issue around our supply chain at the moment. And this, I think, is quite risky, as it can result in companies not being willing to recognize when there is a real crisis. There is, however, that clear difference between a crisis and an issue, and I think that Ray helped highlight that. And it really comes down to the fact that with an issue, it will be a disruption, but it's not going to have the potential to significantly hurt the company's bottom line or reputation. Whereas with a crisis, it's a major critical event, likely to be a long-term disruption on the business with the potential to cause financial loss, and I guess with the potential to significantly harm the company's reputation. I think the challenge is these definitions can blur very easily, as an issue can become a crisis. And similarly, one company's issue is another company's crisis. It may be an issue for a computer manufacturer that there is a chip shortage because of a fire at one of its suppliers. However, for that supplier, it would be a crisis if this represented 50% of their sales. So as a general rule, I think that it's probably best to worry about an issue through the lens of being a crisis, because that way you're probably in the right frame of mind if it actually becomes one.
Very diplomatically put, Viv. Okay, so I guess when I think of crisis, I think of something on the lines of, for example, the Tylenol crisis back in the early 80s, where somebody had been tampering with the bottles, which unfortunately resulted in loss of life. But with the Tylenol crisis, I think that in terms of crises, that was one that generally people felt was handled very well. So would you agree, though, that that would be put into the crisis category?
So MBA classrooms around the world use that as a starting off point for how to effectively manage a crisis. And I think that Tylenol took steps that no other company had taken in the past to act extremely fast and pulling Tylenol from the shelves, taking huge financial losses. And yes, that surely could have put Tylenol out of business if they had not taken the steps that they did, I believe.
And I think with the steps that they took, they recovered their market share and stock price within a year or so, actually.
Relatively quickly, yes.
Okay, right. So with that in mind then, so with our panelists' thoughts on what constitutes a crisis or an emergency or an incident, we would like to revert to a poll question. This is the first poll question of this afternoon or evening. So we want to get a feel for our audience's crisis experience. Now, other than COVID, have you, as an executive or a senior manager or a board member, experienced a crisis which could have caused very significant financial loss or bankruptcy? It's a simple yes or no. So I hope that you can all see this in front of your screens now. And I'm going to wait a moment while we gather up some results. So once again, other than COVID, have you, as an executive or board member, experienced a crisis which could have caused significant financial loss or bankruptcy? So Helen has put the poll question up in front of the screen, and we're just going to wait for the results to come through. Right, okay, so We have 27% have said yes, and 73% therefore have said no. Interesting, okay. Right, well, in that case then, moving on then to the second question, we'd like to get each of the panelists' thoughts on what they think have been the biggest change for board crisis preparedness as a result of COVID. So, Ray, could we look to you for this one first, please?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Chris. What we know from academic research is that boards only pay attention to a few stimuli and focus on stimuli they are more familiar with. Boards can suffer from cognitive constraints, resulting in boards failing to tackle crisis effectively. Because of a lack of knowledge and experience in crisis resolution, directors are not cognitively equipped to perceive the seeds of the crisis. They do not have the necessary cognitive background to identify and understand such signals. So what COVID has done, however, is it has provided every board in the world with a crisis experience, an experience which they are now more familiar with and thus will be more equipped to overcome the cognitive constraints and take on future crisis events.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Ray. Right, okay then. So, and Eliza or Viv, you're more than welcome to chime in there if you have anything to add at all.
I'll chime in. I think that it's quite interesting. I was looking into this, and there was a global survey of companies and boards across 23 countries undertaken by INSEAD late last year. I think you'll find that on the Singapore Institute of Directors website as well. And what that found was that boards have taken a much more active approach in helping companies communicate with their stakeholders. They've been much more involved both with stakeholders and shareholders. And I think I'd probably emphasize with rather than to, because it's become much more of a two-way engagement rather than companies speaking directly at or to their stakeholders. So I think COVID has demonstrated the value of clear communications in a crisis and probably the role that boards can play to help management. I think it's helping management really to deliver consistent messages in a reliable, empathetic way to help build and sustain trust, and trust is at the bottom of all of this. And I think that it's also interesting that the same survey, the INSEAD one, found that some companies formed smaller groups comprising board members and management to tackle specific issues. This might be something they've never done before, but it was something that they felt necessary and needed to do because this was the way that they could help address and tackle some of the COVID issues, particularly say around risk management or employee health and wellness. So I guess that I suspect that this probably is a fairly active participatory role. I think it's going to continue. I think it's going to continue rather than diminish as we move into the new business normal.
Thank you, Viv. Eliza.
I think I'm going to respond to the next question more about things in addition to COVID. I feel like, we've talked about this. The main role of the board is to hire and fire the CEO and then to provide guidance. And I'm seeing some boards getting more involved to try to help because it's not business as usual or wasn't business as usual, and then maybe alleviate some of the pressure on the CEO. But my view is that the board role should be rather stand backish and enabling management to manage COVID. I think it's much more in the management camp. Except for industries where it's pretty close to, I guess, the crisis level, which would be airlines, travel, some of the F&B. Because, the guideline for board is, I think it's noses in, fingers out. So you don't want too much of the board saying, well, it's a crisis, so let's get in there and run the company, because that's not our job.
Thank you. Okay, then, so I guess that leads us on then, and we've kind of touched on this slightly, is beyond COVID, what are boards doing in the real world to manage crises? And Elisa, I'll go back to you. Is there anything else you'd want to add in there?
Sure. I was going to give a real world example. I'm on a board in Australia where we had a malfunction of equipment that we provide to some of our clients. The equipment is from a third-party vendor. It's not from us. Nevertheless, the clients to whom we provide it see it as ours. And in January, and basically it's payment terminals. So in January, we had a number of our merchants who couldn't take payments. And I would categorize this as traumatic as it was. It's somewhere between an incident and an emergency. It probably affected, I think the numbers we've shared publicly are under 10% of our merchants. And what was amazing to me was watching, I was not on the board yet, but watching the board that I joined, how they supported, and again, supporting the management rather than doing something instead. So the main spokesperson for all of this was the CEO, not the board. And we were very careful about that, or they were, that the board wasn't out talking. It's kind of interesting, we're addressing it in the annual report, which has not been issued yet, but we've said this publicly, how proud the board is of the culture of the firm, that the first thing everybody did was take care of the customers. You know, which merchants are down, what can we do? How do we get terminals out to them as quickly as possible? How do we mitigate the impact? How do we, and we've still got claims going on. Are there people who've lost money because of this? What can we do to help them? Really proud of the customer centricity of the company. And I suppose, I don't necessarily want to compare us with Tylenol, but hopefully what people will remember after all this is that we stepped in. It's something we wish hadn't have happened, but seeing as it did, that the way the whole company focused was not on the company revenues or company goals, but what could we do to help our customers? And I think that showed the real mettle of the management. The best thing the board could do in that circumstance really was provide support to the CEO and potentially have a few discussions about what are some business as usual things that can be dropped right now so that the CEO and the management team can focus on this. I do think a learning from it, you know, to me, it's interesting. We had only one provider of these terminals. And even though, you know, there's a risk committee and it had looked at things, and it's something that you could see how it had happened because there aren't very many providers of these terminals and they've consolidated over time. So at one point we had several, but it became one. And so maybe that's something to reconsider in looking at risk. And I think the other thing is just, did we have a good enough plan for how to deal with crisis? And I actually think our team handled it very well. You know, PR stepped up in the right way. One of the most important things, I think, for the board and for any management team in risk is communicate to shareholders, communicate to customers. Well, it's basically you're communicating to all stakeholders, right? The public, because the news is on you, your clients, because they're the most important thing, your investors, because they want to know, and your employees, because they feel bad, it's hitting them, they want to know what's going on. And so being able to do that and to get that comms out there clearly and effectively, continuously, repetitively, is really important. So I think for that, and maybe, COVID, if people haven't had an incident like that, it's really, there's a lot that people need to focus on about when these things happen, because we try with risk committees and lots of other board roles to predict, to mitigate, but stuff happens. Are we prepared to deal with it in the best possible way? And is the board there to support management, but in my opinion, not to supplant them?
I love your term culture early on, Elisa, because I think the culture is very important here. It's really what we're seeing is that where boards are already actively involved, for example, with a company's purpose, or with a risk assessment, or with ESG. They're already embedded. They're already being able to help management, and as a result can help management respond a lot more quickly and appropriately in terms of a crisis. I think Harvard Business Review last year called it something like, there's nothing like a crisis to ignite innovation. And I think, if you think back, I think back about 13, 15 months, and you say, well, you think back then and how companies were suddenly having to completely revamp. They were changing their production runs. That's not a management decision alone. That is with the board. That is changing production runs to produce ventilators, masks, the things that were needed. They were doing things to help the community. They were doing things to help the company. They were doing things to help their employees. And I see all of that as being a critical function, not just of management, but also of the board, because everybody should be there to support. I think that the board definitely has that role of supporting company management, but I think COVID has really demonstrated that boards can and should flex that level of support to meet different situations. And if there's any watchwords for me coming out of the whole of this COVID situation, it's really, agility, foresight, adaptability, and resilience. And if you look at those four, that has to be at a management level. It has to be very much at a board level, because the two working together is what builds success.
Thanks very much, Viv. Ray, is there anything you'd like to add to that? I would also like to stress that we've actually already had a question that's come in from the audience, which does pertain to what we've just been discussing. So I do just want to raise this very quickly now to make sure that we get some thoughts from Ray on this as well. So this comes from Steve Stein. Thank you very much, Steve. To Elisa's point, what do the other panelists think about her suggestion that the board's job is not to intervene in a time of crisis, and that managing the COVID crisis is the responsibility of the management team? So this question here from Steve is sort of in the realms of what we've just been discussing. So Ray, is there anything you'd like to add on in there?
Sure, yeah. Thanks, Steve, for submitting that question. I think this question really drives at crisis management and crisis preparedness, and more importantly, the risk assessment and the impact and probability of an event occurring. So if the company has a proper crisis management framework and that risk assessment has been done properly, it will be elevated to the board at the right time, and the board's attention will be drawn to it, and the board will come in and contribute. Up until a certain period of time, though, it's left in the realm of management. So I think that's the answer to Steve's question. And in line with Elisa's comments earlier as well.
That was Ray being diplomatic. I'll be less diplomatic. I think that the board really should get involved as and when it needs to be involved. And I think that this is, I think that the traditional functions of the board absolutely exist. But I think we've moved way beyond that, not just because of COVID, but because that is the expectation, not just of shareholders, but also of stakeholders. They're looking for more from their companies. It's not always something that just the management can provide. And it needs to be something that where the board has the expertise. And I think that, why is the board there? The board is there not just to appoint the CEO, it's also there to help guide. It's also there to ensure that there's an expertise and skill set that is not necessarily prevalent with the management. And I think that this is where the board can really add value, and it's something that I'm pleased to see boards getting more involved where they've decided to get involved, because I think that there hasn't been this sort of, some people talk about overreach. I don't know if there's been overreach, but there's certainly something which I think boards have been very effective where they have been involved.
And I've got a comment in the chat box from Fiona Carney, which I think sort of complements some of these comments we just heard here. I would hope that the role of the board is not only to hire and fire the CEO. I would look at this more around how we enable the right person to be the best that they can be, and if not, support their transition. Thank you very much, Fiona, for those thoughts. And okay, and with that then, we'll move on to the next question then. So, again, this is, again, in line with what we've just been discussing. How has the relationship between management and their boards changed as a result of COVID? Do you think that that will continue? We have basically sort of touched on this, but if there's anything else that anybody would like to add to this, then please do go ahead.
So again, I guess I'm being the controversial one here, but I think that the role of the board, it may be that there are more frequent meetings. I mean, interestingly, Australian boards meet far more often than, say, a US board, which meets quarterly. So it may be driving some more meetings or some more side meetings. I still don't think that the role has changed. And I don't want my comments to be interpreted that boards aren't involved. I think boards are actively involved. You know, you go to a board meeting, you're responsible for understanding the materials, you're responsible for making some decisions. But I do think boards aren't running the company, and the lines between board and management should be clear. And I think the main role of the board is to support the management, which is translated at the end of the day, if you want to make it very black and white, into hiring and firing the CEO, and not to be running the company. And so it may be that during COVID, boards have needed to step up, particularly in certain companies where there wasn't enough horsepower, if you will, or maybe I should use firepower with the engines over me, to get the work done. But I do believe strongly that there's a big separation between a board and management. And it's great if they weren't working well together before, that now, if because of COVID, they're working better together before. But I don't think those working relationships should have changed because of a crisis. Maybe some of the personal relationships have changed as people gotten to know each other better or work together more.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And Viv, is there anything that you'd like to add on to that at all?
I think we've covered that fairly well in terms of the situation. I think that I go slightly further than Elisa does in terms of what I've observed with boards, and I think that where boards have been effective, they can be very effective. I agree, though, that there is always going to be a line between the board and management. That is how it should be. Where that line can be blurred in times of crisis, or where it can be blurred because there's a special expertise, then let's blur it. I think that we have to move past a very traditional stance into a new way of looking at boards and management.
Sorry, can I just say one thing? Two things, actually, short of arguing in public. I think
you can argue with me in public, go for it.
Well, we'll have this on, you know, what boards are supposed to do is prescribed by regulation. And so I don't think you want boards overstepping their bounds. And I don't think as a director, you want to be overstepping your bounds, because you could end up with a lot of, you know, liability. But I did want to mention, which I forgot to say, is that there are crises where management has done something wrong, right? And in that case, Viv and I are aligned. It might be it's a corner case, but, you know, if we have a CEO who's corrupt, or a management team where there's been financial misdoing, then the board must step in.
Totally agree.
But I think that's one of the problems that companies in crisis face, is that fine line between when the board should step in and when they should allow management to handle it. And there's a disincentive for boards to step in and to start making decisions and contributing. And because of that disincentive, sometimes the crisis can get ahead of the organization, ahead of management, and then the real pressure comes onto the board. But this is not a clear science. There's a lot of feel involved, and knowing when to sit back and when to lean in. So,
thank you. Ray, I mean, I was actually going to go on to ask a next question, and I was going to direct this towards yourself. I'm conscious of the fact that we have sort of danced around this area a bit, but if you have anything to add here, just want to ask you if you've seen any evidence there has been board overreach as a result of the pandemic and the crisis.
So, and this touches on what Elisa said in relation to the personal relationships that form or develop between management and the board in a crisis. You have new relationships, new doors, new understandings of each other that open. And those openings can change an environment. So let me take a step back and say that academic research and data on the current pandemic will take years to be published. But my conversations with board members tells me that board overreach is happening in some organizations. That doesn't mean all, that doesn't mean most, but it's happening in some organizations. And boards during non-crisis periods generally focus on matters such as governance, strategy, performance, compliance, and risk management. The decisions that boards make on those matters tend to play out over the long term. A crisis event, however, creates a situation where the board is forced to give more advice in the short term. And the decisions that the board makes in crisis situations can blur into those operational matters. And once that incursion occurs, the board has inserted themselves. It can be hard for them to pull back. Management can become dependent upon their newfound resources in the board, and the board may enjoy their new influence. Now, an effective tool for managing this overreach and guard against board overreach is the appropriate use of the learning phase of a crisis, which is the final phase of crisis management, where a company reflects on what went wrong. And it's during this period of reflection where the boundaries can be reestablished. The board can move back to their traditional roles, and management can take on theirs. But you know, I guess my question would be, going back to Eliza, is, you know, I think you're from the perception that overreach is not happening within your organizations, and I guess my question would be, how is that? What are your companies doing differently that prevent that overreach from happening? And I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on how overreach is not occurring within those organizations.
I'm not sure of the answer to that question. I was thinking about one more thing while we were talking, which is, we're talking here, I think, primarily about public boards, listed companies. So in a private board, you know, if you're on a board with a KKR or a TPG or a Square Peg, you know, or a venture firm, I think the behavior is different, because in those cases, there aren't a lot of laws and there are laws, but there aren't as many laws and regulations about behavior, and there's more expected of the board. So I did want to make that clear. I'm assuming, since we're at the board director program for the FT, that we're talking about listed companies, but I do think there are probably different things, I would say, for small private one. Well, I don't know, Ray. I think I'd go back on what I've said before, where Steve's poking at me. He knows me. I've sent him an email in the middle of this call going, "You're poking at me online here," and Vivian, and we're all. It's good. It's good to have I think it's always more interesting to have a bit of a debate, but I think that board roles are pretty clear. And we're there to help guide management, help make prioritization decisions like resource allocation. So for example, during COVID, I think a lot of companies, I think either you or Viv gave an example about an assembly line change. That is a huge decision. That's a board change. I think another decision is, do we shut down offices and save that money and plow it into something else? Do we change the healthcare? Do we reallocate resources? So a lot of companies had to really change the budgeting and resource allocation they'd done for the prior year to add more money for technology, for endpoint security and technology. Like, not everybody, in a lot of companies, not everybody had a home computer. That sounds maybe crazy for us white collar types, but there are a lot of companies where people had a desktop and didn't bring something home and now had to work from home. So all those companies had to provision a bunch of individuals to be at home with a chair, maybe even a desk, a laptop, and endpoint security that meant that the accounting files or accounts payable or whatever it was were not out in the ether unprotected. So if you're changing the budget that's agreed or other resource allocation, you know, moving money from online advertising to tech stack, then I think the board gets involved, or at least says to the management, here's how we think about the priorities. But making the decision about, okay, we're starting to come back into the office, should it be Wednesday or Friday or how many days? that's a management decision, and I don't think the board should be part of that. Unless that we get invited for the donuts or something, then I want to have a vote.
Yes.
And
yes.
Eliza, I think you make a good point there in that, yes, agreed. As the board director program, generally what we tend to deal with are regulations regarding duties and so on for directors of listed companies. But of course, we do also hope that for privately owned companies and to a certain extent NGOs as well would, to a certain extent, be looking to emulate the procedures, the structure, the policies, etc., that you would see on a listed board. You'd hope that they would be using that as a best practice, as a model for them to follow.
Yeah, I didn't mean that they would circumvent things that we think are important legally or morally, but in a smaller company, I think the boards are often more active, right? So they might,
yes,
if noses in, fingers out isn't quite as strict. You might have your shoulder in or something. I mean, I'm not sure what the compromise is.
Yeah, and then of course, if it's a board on a startup, then they're pretty much operating as management quite often. Ray, is there anything you wanted to add to that? I do have a question that's come in from the audience, but is there anything you wanted to add before I move on to that one?
No, I think we're ready to move on.
Right, so same area, but slightly more nuanced. Question from Kapila. Thank you very much, Kapila. How does the board time their involvement with crises on the horizon? And the context of this question is relating to climate crisis. Anybody want to go ahead with that?
I can take it as a start. I think ESG is hugely on most boards' list of things that they're worrying about right now. It's not a crisis in the sense that it's sudden or whatever. In my thing, it's not unplanned incident or emergency in that sense, but it's a global crisis for sure. And it is pretty close to out of control and has broad impact. So I think the boards are heavily engaged in looking with companies at how can we reduce our carbon footprint? How can we meet the UN sustainability goals? Most boards are putting out ESG reports now. It might, in the broader scheme of things, in many people's opinion, be too little, too late. I think we should have been working on it for some time, but I think there is some movement now and boards are heavily involved because I think that that's I wouldn't call that a company crisis, that's a world crisis and we're all part of it, and most governments are creating and stakeholders are starting to create pressure for boards to do something about it. So I think that's a great point, whoever raised it.
I don't want to dismiss this question, but that type of crisis is not really under the umbrella that we're trying to cover today. That's a different type of crisis. And I think when we went over our definitions of crisis in the beginning, it's more of these short-term decisions that need to be implemented by the board, not more long-term. So if we think just the speed and the impact that a crisis can have, the environmental aspects aren't checking those boxes in the short term. So yeah, I'm not dismissing the question. It's relevant, but under the definitions of crisis that we're looking at today, I'm not sure that it fits there.
But isn't it interesting from what you've just said, Ray, because that really does show us that perhaps boards should be looking at these things. I would say that this falls very much within a risk matrix, which should have been there 3-5 years ago, because people were talking about this 3-5 years ago. But I think that the challenge is that it is now being stakeholder driven. It is also being driven by the financial funders, with the result that is just changed the whole ball game. So it's escalated it more than anything else. I think before it was like this slow boiling effect, which was out there, but it wasn't an effect which was really driving change. You could still be a coal mining company and still not worry too much. These days, you suddenly find that coal mining companies are beginning to realize that they need to sell off those assets and focus on other things. So I think that we have moved it may have been driven by ESG, it may have been driven by stakeholders, it may have been driven by financing, but the point is it has become really top of the agenda. And I would hope that boards would have had this in terms of, and companies in terms of a risk matrix maybe 3-4 years ago, and have been following it, because that enables them to respond a lot better to it. So if you're following something, you can at least then adapt and become more agile as you go along. That really answers the question in terms of when does a board become more involved? It becomes involved when there is a clear risk to the company.
Well, but that's an interesting issue. That's one of the problems with climate change, isn't it? Which is that what is the risk to the company? If you're coal mining, you've been looking at this for some time. If you happen to be in New South Wales and Australia, the government's still supporting you. So it isn't in your interest potentially to stop mining coal. I mean, that's a problem, right? Which is the board's fiduciary responsibility is to the stakeholders. And well, it has been to the shareholders. And I think publicly, what's happening now is we're talking about boards and having a broader responsibility to stakeholders, which include our children and our grandchildren and people who are going to have to inherit this world after us. But it is an interesting issue for boards, because if you'd been on the board of a coal mining company, or are now, which I'm not, but if you're supposed to be maximizing returns for your investors, then you put it on a risk matrix and say, well, maybe it's going to hurt our returns in 10 years, but right now, we still keep going because we're supposed to give returns to our investors, right? So, but if you're looking at a broader stakeholder lens, which is, it seems that the world is moving towards, and we say there are stakeholders who are neither our employees nor our investors, but the world at large, then maybe you take a different point of view. But it's, I think, a very interesting perspective about what does a board member, what are their obligations, what are they supposed to look at?
If I can just add one last thing.
Sure.
If I can just add one last thing. Yes, Viv, the difference between the risk matrix, we can say 5 years ago or 10 years ago, is that these ESG elements, they're in the risk matrix, their impact and their probability are increasing. So if you rank everything in a risk matrix on a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being the least dangerous, 5 being the most dangerous, and 1 being the least impactful to the organization, 5 being the most impactful, they've certainly increased and elevated in ways that we would not have expected 5 or 10 years ago, or had planned for 5 or 10 years ago. And so now they need to be more at the attention of the board because of their increased impact and probability. So
thank you very much, Ray.
That's my thoughts on that.
Yeah, okay, great. Obviously, we could spend a lot more time talking about this particular point, and I do have a very good question here and comment from Steve. Steve, I am going to come back to that a little bit later on. So for the now, I will move on to my next question. But I don't want to belittle the crisis in any way, shape or form. But do you think that companies and boards should have been better prepared for COVID? Very, very difficult question here. But Ray, I'm going to go back to you again for this, please.
Yeah, I think my thoughts on this touch on something that Elisa said earlier, but let me throw out what I think, and that's that it would have been a hard argument for corporations to make pre-COVID that significant expenditure should have been dedicated to preparing for a global pandemic. That said, with a proper risk assessment, risk matrix, and crisis management framework, multiple threats in the risk assessment should have directed the crisis management framework to prepare for work from home. And I believe, however, not many companies were in fact prepared for work from home, which is what Elisa said, not having laptops, and not having a proper desk environment. So my answer to the question is no, companies should not have been better prepared for COVID, but yes, they should have been better prepared for work from home.
Okay.
Let me add on to that. I mean, I've been following over many years the sort of different risk surveys that are put out every year. Insurance companies, consultancies, they all put them out in the first quarter. normally tied into Davos. And I think what I found shocking is that if you look back at Q1 last year, based on the surveys taken only a few months previously, so this would have been just about pre-COVID, global risk managers, those very people that boards and company management rely on, did not consider health risks as a top 10 business risk in most places other than in Africa. And you know, that concerns me, but it concerns me because I think that the way risk managers are looking at things is that they've been too caught up thinking inside the box and analyzing what has happened rather than looking at what could happen. And it's this sort of deeper sort of risk analysis the board should be pushing for, I think, from management in their risk matrix and crisis management frameworks. I mean, I am hopeful that when we look at this moving forward, we're going to see a much broader assessment of risks and the way that they often interact with one another, because particularly in terms of reputational risk, I mean, that's my whole area, but reputational risk is something that is sometimes called the risk of risks, because it actually underlines or overlays, depending on which way you look at it, all other risks.
Thank you. Is there anything to add to that?
No, I think basically, I'm not sure where this goes, Chris, but Chris, are you talking to us or somebody? Okay. You know, boards need a plan for this kind of stuff. They need a crisis management plan. We need to, and this is back to what Ray is saying, you know, we should have had some stuff that we knew how to do. We need a crisis management plan that says, what do we do in a crisis, whatever the crisis is going to be. We need an annual exercise. I know that on a couple of boards I've been on, we do this. We do a, you know, fake, like some people call it war games, whatever, but these fake exercises, and there are consultants who come in and let you do them. Sorry, the real exercises, fake crises to practice. You do need some board committee delegation. So again, back to the people who are worried that I'm saying the board's not involved at all. Like, you know, if we have this kind of risk, here are the things the board committee should do. And then, like, from my point of view, out of these 6 points I've made, 3 of them are about communication. You need a communications plan for stakeholders. You need a communications plan for investors specifically. And you need like a disclosure plan to the market with, you know, that your CMO knows or your head of PR knows what are we doing out there. Sort of the way when you use Tylenol in the beginning, we talked about how they handled bringing the product in and what they told the public. So if you ask me, you know, I don't know that we could have planned for this particular thing, but everybody should have those 6 elements in place. So it's like the pre-crisis planning. So when the crisis happens, you know what to do. And then afterwards, we do what Ray said, which is we sit around and go, okay, did we do it right? And if not, let's get better next time. Hopefully there's no next time, but let's work on this.
Well, I think it's interesting because you're right in terms of the communications aspect. I just say that those communication plans also need to tie in with the operational risk plans and crisis plans. Very often you'll have a very strong ops plan that can be put into place and a very weak comms plan. And in fact, the communications and the ops should really sit side by side, and it should be developed together so that you have something which really speaks on behalf of the company, because that is absolutely critical. You can't have one without the other, and there's still enough companies that treat them separately.
That actually leads us on to the next question quite well then. And Viv, I'm going to go back to you again for this. Just keeping it simple, what does a good organization do to plan? And what does a bad organization do to plan?
Let me come off of mute there. So I was coughing. I'm going to obviously look at what a good organization does, because that way we can then define backwards, because if you're a bad organization, you haven't done it. Over the years, I'm going to go back to some research. So Ray's going to be happy here because I'm going to bring some research in. And if you look at it, there's been quite a lot of research into how companies handle crises. And some of that was started very early on, back in the 80s, by people at Oxford University. And it's been validated again a lot more recently. What it really reveals is that companies who recover the fastest from a crisis are those that are well prepared, have strong leadership, are seen to take action quickly, and they really go out of their way to communicate that action, really communicate what they have done. And obviously, if you've got a situation that requires it, there should obviously be a high level of empathy in there as well. I think Elisa said earlier, communicate, communicate, communicate. You can never over-communicate during a crisis. People need to hear from the company what is being done, the actions that are being taken. So people need to see leadership in action. And I think that COVID has really highlighted this, but it's also given boards that opportunity for some boards to become involved a bit more in terms of part of that solution. So, you know, I'd say that companies at a board level need to take a deeper dive into their crisis response. They need to review the plans. They need to ensure that the process is in place, the training, the people have the roles and responsibilities clear, map out that worst case scenario, future reputational risk scenarios, and then really reassess the resilience and vulnerabilities. And as Lisa said, bring in crisis experts where appropriate. You need to stress test, you need to run the simulations, you need to test the plans. And you can't have plans sitting around not tested. You also can't have a comms plan that isn't linked into an ops plan.
Thank you very much. And if anybody wants to add anything to that, then please feel free to do so. If not, I can move on to the next question. Okay. Right then, Ray. Geopolitical issues have really become quite important. Now, how can companies balance competing interests?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. This relates to the first phase of crisis management, which is signal detection. And a subsection of signal detection is escalation protocols. And this reverts back to some comments that we've had in this discussion earlier between when management should be on top of an event and when it needs to be escalated to the board. So clear protocols should be established and approved by the board as to when management should inform the board of material matters. So if a board learns of a material matter from media when management knew, this could indicate a lack of escalation protocols or a failure to follow those protocols, and corrective action would need to be taken. But this again, when I talk about these, it sounds quite simple. In reality, it's a lot more complex. It's trying to figure out that balance between how much do we bug the board about this event that's taken place versus, you know, we need their input, we need their help, and they should be involved. And that's not an easy line to determine, but it has to, attempts have to be made at defining those protocols.
Geopolitics, I think it's a nightmare. I think for many companies, it has really become one of those risks that they can't control. And I think a lot of what they can try and do is to mitigate some of the aspects of it. Yes, you can do your scenario planning. It's definitely important, large part because there's rarely a black or white decision to be made. And multiple interests have to be balanced. Look at HSBC and what they've been through. You cannot make everyone happy. So you've got to make the decisions around which people are you going to be able to make the most happy. It's a very tough decision. And how actions are viewed in one country can be totally different in another. And there may be problems trying to separate the rhetoric of the situation from the reality. So it's not an easy situation. I think it takes agility, it takes the adaptability that I mentioned before, and being very light on your feet, because whatever you say one day can be misinterpreted the next.
Nice, thank you very much. Okay then, so moving on then, crisis response plans. Now, as Viv has alluded to earlier on, and I think as we all know by now, communications comprises a huge aspect of this. So with regards to crisis response plans, what tips do you have that can be considered from a communications perspective? And Eliza, do you want to kick off this one?
Well, I think I got ahead of myself and sort of said what I thought there had to be. There need to be those kind of 6 sets of rules. But I think if I summarize what people have said here, as we sit around thinking about the next crisis or what is a crisis, make sure we take a broader view of risk, maybe the black swan. So Viv mentioned, no one had thought about health. In the company I mentioned, no one had thought about the fact that we had a single provider, because things had it was like frog in boiling water, happened over time. So maybe a broader view of even what the craziest risk could be. A plan that's sort of simple but robust. If it's too complicated, people can't follow it. Maybe an exercise, an annual exercise, continual horizon screening. So to have those things in place, then when you get to the crisis, you'll be better set.
Thank you. And Vivian, anything you'd like to add there?
No, I couldn't have said it better. I think Lisa's covered everything that we have there very well. I think that it's one of those areas where you can never do enough planning, you can never do enough communication, and the more that you really focus on those areas, it's going to help moving forward.
Interesting. The communications expert says that he couldn't have said it better. Eliza, that's kudos to you.
Well, I know, but I think he's still disputing a bunch of things with me from the beginning, so it's okay.
Right, okay, then moving on. So now from the discussion, there have been some positive things that have come out of the problems over the past year. Now, the challenge for boards is to keep that momentum going. So I'd like to ask each of you, what do you think boards should be doing more of in a post-COVID environment? Eliza, I'm going to go to you first for that one, please.
Yeah, I think I can say that really simply. I think what I've said a couple times here and probably everybody else is just a bit more preparedness, a bit more broad-mindedness about what are possible risks, and a bit deeper thinking about being prepared. And I think people are learning.
Yep, I'll add on to that and say that I think that the more you can do in terms of crisis training and simulations, even if they're only half-day simulations or a couple of hours, both at either board level or at a management level, you are really then beginning to focus in on what issues might be. And there are going to be some issues which are much more board related, obviously to do with the CEO, it could be to do with sexual harassment, all of those issues that come up and really need to be tackled at a board level. But all of those can be simulated. And I think that the more training that companies do, the better.
Thank you. Ray.
Yeah, I think my comments are right in line with what Eliza and Viv have said. But before I answer your question, Chris, what I think I need to do is provide some academic insights. We know from survey data that most listed companies have some type of crisis management framework. But we also know that only half of listed companies have engaged in crisis simulation activities. So it's difficult for me to understand the mindset of boards and individual board members who do not include crisis simulation activities in their annual agendas. But one possible explanation for this from the academic research is that board members tend to have selective perceptions, and directors' selective perceptions of the environments leads to limited visions of a crisis. As such, directors' interpretations of how to solve the crisis is narrowed, which in turn reduces the likelihood that directors will take a strategic decision to even take on tackling a crisis. So as a result, boards remain passive, waiting for the crisis to escalate, and the question becomes, how can boards widen their perception of being able to contribute to the solutions of a crisis? So from my perspective, the answer is these crisis simulation activities. And this gets back to your original question, Chris. What should boards be doing more of in a post-COVID world? Well, pre-COVID, a great deal of board meetings were held in person. Additionally, the majority of board training sessions were held in person. But in the post-COVID world, boards now are more comfortable meeting online and working together online. So the idea of doing multiple hour online crisis simulations is much more practical. So that said, I think few companies are taking such training though. And I'm not sure why they're not embracing more of this training. But in that training is where holes in the organizational crisis management framework are figured out and pointed out. So.
Okay then. So following on from that, then why do you think boards are not doing enough in terms of group training in broader areas?
Sure. The academic literature doesn't provide any insight on this, but my intuition tells me that when boards meet in person, there's a strong motivation to focus on the traditional board roles and are more directly tied to immediate value adding to the firm. So the first hurdle has to be overcome is getting buy-in. That valuable time should be allotted for training. The second hurdle is for the chair or secretary or other executive to take on the task of determining what training course would be relevant to all of the board members. And identifying training courses that are relevant to all the board members is really challenging and can be quite stressful. And then the final hurdle is capturing the interest and attention of board members when training is in progress. So all three of these hurdles are difficult to overcome and lead to companies taking the easy road of doing individual self-study. And I'm not going to say that companies can't benefit from individual self-study, but they are not replacements for group training and the unique development and learning that's derived and arrived from that working together and on exercises such as crisis management simulations. So, it's times have changed now with the post-COVID environment. I think there's an opportunity for less of these individual training activities and more group activities.
Got it. Okay, great. All right, thank you very much for that, Ray. Right, well, on that note then, I'm going to move on to our second poll question. So I want to get a feel for our audience's crisis preparedness. So do you feel that executives or board members in your organization are properly trained and prepared for a crisis? This is a simple yes or no. Once again, do you feel that executives or board members in your organization are properly trained and prepared for a crisis? And I'll wait for a moment while we collate the results.
And while we're waiting, Chris, I'll say we had a number of questions come into the Q&A. I think some of those Q&A questions we've touched on in other responses. So it's hard for us in real time to jump and keep a flow. With the time left, I'm not sure that we're going to be able to get to those, but I hope that parts of our answers from earlier questions have addressed some of those.
Thank you, Ray. Right, okay, results are in. So we have 33% of the audience say yes, they do feel that they're properly trained and prepared for a crisis, and 67% say no. Right, okay, great. Well, thank you very much for that then. As Ray pointed out, yep, we are a little bit short of time, so I am going to move on very quickly here then. So we do have a couple of questions from the audience, but I think we have basically touched on most of that. What I'm going to do first of all here, I am going to jump straight into our closing thoughts. So in the context of the conversation that we've had today, Viv, I'd like to invite you to address your closing thoughts for this session.
Sure. My closing thoughts would be, don't let your guard down. Just because the pandemic appears to be waning, it doesn't mean that companies and boards should relax. I think the role of the boards has expanded, and I think embrace those changes from a board perspective, stay engaged with stakeholders, both internal and external. I think there's actually a real opportunity for the role of boards to become much more widely appreciated and for boards to be seen to make a difference.
Thank you very much, Viv. Eliza, moving on to you, please.
I think in support of Viv, as before, it's communicate, 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 and be prepared to do that. And maybe just in your role as a board member, make sure your company is really looking for the black swan instance, or covering the ground. Not that you need to do something about it right now, but you need to think about maybe more broadly about all the possibilities, and maybe our eyes have been open to that over the last couple of years.
Thank you, and Ray.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks to everyone for joining us here today. My final thought is to recommend that if you're on a board, to be the driver of crisis management preparedness. If you wait for others to initiate preparedness, it may be too late. Crisis management preparedness and testing your company's crisis management framework is one of the easiest tasks to put off until tomorrow, but the costs of that type of delay can be immense. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ray. Right, I do regret that we weren't able to cover more of the questions that came in from the audience, but many thanks for putting those in anyway. It's clear that we had a lot of engagement from the audience, so I do hope that you have learned something today, that you'll be able to walk away and you'll be able to really sort of directly implement some of what you've learned here today. Thank you very much to the Chamber of Commerce for inviting us to put on this session today. Thank you, of course, to our panelists, Ray, Eliza, and Viv. It is much appreciated. David, I'm going to pass this back over to you then.
Oh, thank you so much, Chris. That was an absolutely brilliant session. So thank you all for your time today. That was so insightful. Viv, I do hope you make it back to Singapore soon. We look forward to seeing you. Raymond, thank you so much for logging on so early from the other side of the world to put in your insights as well. That was fantastic. And Eliza, well done for powering through the air display in the background as well. That was fantastic, and we look forward to seeing that at the weekend. And of course, Chris, thank you so much for chairing such a really vibrant discussion. I think lots and lots of takeaways there. Thank you. So it would be remiss of me not to let you know about some of the up and coming events from the Chamber. It has been a really exciting time actually for the UK. So we have a fireside chat with the Paymaster General for the UK Government, the Right Honourable Penny Mordaunt, on the 24th of August. She'll be talking about all things cyber and post-Brexit Britain and how we build back better. So a really great opportunity to hear from the UK Government on the 24th next week. We've also got an event in plan around the UK's sort of confirmation of being an ASEAN dialogue partner, the first country, I think, in 25 years to get such a status. So we'll make sure that we bring our members some access to what that actually means for business and how we can get involved with the community. We've got a great discussion around the UK-Singapore Digital Economy Agreement coming up in a couple of weeks' time. That's a focused roundtable discussion. We've got a dialogue with members on the Singapore Green Plan with two of the Singapore Parliament, members of the Singapore Parliament, which is great, and we're hoping that to be a breakfast in person as well. And the future of green data centres on the sustainability theme as well, coming up later in September too. So some really great events coming up. Following today, you'll receive a feedback form. Please do fill that out. It really does help the Chamber team and myself to understand what you'd like to hear more of and how we can keep improving to bring you great content like today's session. And that leaves me to say a final farewell and a thank you from myself and the Chamber team. We look forward to welcoming you at an event soon, and hopefully in person as things start or feel like they're starting to open up. And have a great afternoon and rest of the day for everyone on the call. Take care and thanks again. Bye-bye.